Okay, I think we will get started tonight. Thank you for joining us. I wanted to acknowledge that the Metropolitan Chapter of the Victorian Society acknowledges our presence in Lenape-Hocking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenape, and recognizes New York City as a past, present, and future crossroads for many Indigenous people. If you are interested in becoming a member and supporting our upcoming talks, the link is in the chat. Our next talk is October 28th with two contemporary artists, Stephen Burkman and Stacy Renee Morrison, who are examining the Victorian era through the personas of Schimmel Zohar and Sylvia de Wolf Ostrander, using glass plate photography and possessions found in a trunk on the sidewalk of Lower Manhattan. The link for this lecture and our November and December lectures is also in the chat, so please, please join us. And I am pleased to introduce design historian Carolyn Hanna. Dr. Hanna wrote her dissertation on Henry Varnum Poor, Crow House Craft and Design. Her talk tonight is drawn from her thesis on James Carr and his New York pottery, which she has recently revisited in a chapter in the forthcoming Bard Graduate Center exhibition catalog, Majolica Mania, Transatlantic Pottery in England and the United States, 1850 to 1915. Dr. Hanna has taught at the Parsons School of Design, Virginia Commonwealth University, and Bard College. She has previously been a board member of the Victorian Society in America. We will take questions at the end. So as you think of them, please enter them into the chat function throughout tonight.
Thank you, Alexis. Thank you for that kind introduction. I just want to open my presentation and share my screen. Okay, now I can see none of you, but I hope you can see me okay. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. I want to thank you again for that kind introduction. I would like to also thank Eve and Franklin of the lecture committee and also the Victorian Society in New York for the opportunity to speak here in this virtual space tonight. I want to thank you all for coming too. It's a rainy evening here in New York City, and today is Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day, and therefore it feels especially appropriate to acknowledge that most of this story, while an Anglo-American one and an immigrant one, takes place on Lenape land, as Alexis noted, which encompasses northern New Jersey and Manhattan. And the colorful bread plate you see here with its central motif of an idealized image of a Plains Indian was made at the New York City Pottery about 1880, the same period as some of.
Your screen isn't sharing.
It's not sharing.
No.
Let's try that again. Do you see it now?
No.
Okay, sorry about that. We did a run through and that didn't totally fix this. So here we go. Better?
Yes.
Now I can see some of you at least, so I feel less in this weird space. But as I was saying, this colorful bread plate, which you see here, with its central motif of an idealized image of a Plains Indian, was made at the New York City Pottery about 1880, the same period as some of the nation's worst atrocities against Native peoples. And this plate serves as a reminder of that dark period. The word liberty impressed on the feathered headband reminds us that liberty was not fully enjoyed by all people in this great nation. So I just wanted to start out by acknowledging that. I also want to acknowledge that some of the descendants of James Carr are with us tonight. And I want to thank them for support of my research, which has greatly enriched this project, which, as Alexis mentioned, informed my master's thesis at the Bard Graduate Center many years ago, and which I had the great pleasure to revisit recently for the Majolica project. So my story begins here in 1901 with this dignified, courtly looking, learned gentleman in his fine coat and crisp white collar, sitting upon a rather throne-like chair and pointing with perfectly poised fingers to his book so as not to lose his place. This is, of course, James Carr, 80 years old and the second oldest living potter in the country. The rather messy business of making pottery is now 12 years behind him, and he has written a memoir of sorts, a series of 6 letters that appeared in the Crockery and Glass Journal, a weekly trade publication, which began on these letters began on March 21st and ended on April 25th, 1901. These autobiographical accounts, published in the Crockery and Glass Journal, chronicle the life of the potter, 1820 to 1904, from his roots in Staffordshire, England, through Carr's early days working in the pottery industry, both in England and in the United States, and the first years of the New York City pottery through its formative years as Morrison and Carr, 1858 to 71, and also its ultimate demise in 1889. Carr's story is a compelling one of grit and determination, and while personal to him, is representative of the many Anglican potters who came to this country in the 19th century. These men, and they were largely men, trained in the best potteries in the world and brought their skills with them, adapting their knowledge to conditions here. As such, Carr's letters speak to the very real challenges of running a profitable business within the fledgling American ceramics industry, where materials, skilled workers, and capital were often in short supply and competition was fierce. The story also centers around Carr's striving for artistic excellence, and I am showing the medals he won at the peak of his career in the late 1870s, the American Institute Fairs in New York, the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial, and the 1878 Paris Universelle exhibition. Without Carr's participation in these increasingly larger stages, we would probably know very little about the New York City potteries production. Most of Carr's production was of a utilitarian sort, yet he strove to elevate the potter's art, not only by producing technically competent wares, but also by hiring decorators and modelers. His exhibits brought him recognition and were written up in trade journals. It's important to note that Carr saw his participation in these fairs as a civic, even patriotic duty. In January 1875, when the newly formed National Potters Association met in Philadelphia to discuss how it might participate in the World's Fair being held in that city, they addressed how they might confront the issue of their dependence on foreign designs. The leaders, and Carr was second vice president, resolved to create works that sought to challenge the dominance of imported wares by showing not only products that challenge the imported ones in quality, but also new works with designs that are uniquely American. And I will be discussing this further on in my talk. Carr was born in 1820 in Hanley, one of the 6 towns that made up the Pottery district in North Staffordshire, England. He was the eldest child of John and Maria Carr, and as such went to work in the Potteries at the age of 10 years old. We don't know much about this period, other than that he worked for Ralph and John Clue's Pottery and also John Ridgway, where he served an apprenticeship. Both potteries made dishes such as these. Here is Clue's showing General Lafayette's landing in 1824. This is his kind of return to New York, not during the Revolutionary War. And these kinds of dishes here by John Ridgway, these blue and white transfer printed plates that show American sort of scenes of progress. And here we have, just a representative example showing a great building, Boston's insane asylum. But children in the Potteries, as social historian Sue Wilkes has written, did many different jobs. They worked as jiggers, mold runners, oven boys, dipper boys, apprentice painters, and figure makers. The jiggers and mold runners, and you can see some examples of some of these jobs here, helped the dish, plate, and saucer makers, and they worked extremely hard. The jigger turned the potter's wheel, the mold runners carried pots to and from the stoves, and you can see here pots loaded into a sagger being loaded into a kiln. These kids were on their feet all day, and they often had to walk great distances just to get to their jobs. It's worth noting that 2 years after Clue's closed their works in 1834, the brother James went to the US to start a pottery in Troy, Indiana, bringing 36 English-trained potters with him. It didn't succeed for long, and after 11 years, he returned to England. Ridgway's, on the other hand, was where Carr seemed to have really spent his time. This is where he gained his apprenticeship. We don't know exactly what in. It might have been with a dipper. Boys training in the Potteries tended to specialize in with one master. And these were highly segmented productions at this point, with full division of labor. But he learned a great deal during this period. Early historian Simeon Shaw described Ridgway's called-in-place works in 1829 as being judiciously arranged to diminish expense in the several processes, including its location on the canal that eased shipments of coal, material, and finished goods. Shaw also noted the large, well-ventilated, light, airy, commodious rooms, adapted to the processes carried out in them, which stands in stark contrast with the deplorable environmental conditions you see represented down here in this photograph of Hanley, taken 100 years after Carr worked in the Potteries as a boy, but very much emblematic of the serious environmental concerns that affected all workers in the pottery, not only smog, but also lead glaze, certainly hard physical work for developing young bodies. Carr's apprenticeship at Ridgway was cut short when his father died in 1837, and he went to work in earnest. He was 17 and struggled to pay room and board. I think he earned something like 1 shilling a week when he was an apprentice, and about 8 when he left his apprenticeship and started to work on his own, but his room and board was like 9 shillings. So he had to take on extra jobs. I mean, this was grim. He left Hanley. This money was needed to help support his mother and younger siblings. He left Hanley in 1839 and sought more lucrative work elsewhere in England, traveling over 164 miles to Middlesbrough, you know, and this was a great distance in that time. And he showed great, you know, moral character to make this journey. But this was nothing compared to the voyage he would make 5 years later in 1844 when he left England for good. In 1844, Carr made the transatlantic voyage on a ship called the Liverpool, appropriately since it left from Liverpool, and landed in South Street Seaport near Maiden Lane in Lower Manhattan. And I'm showing you a scene of that a little 10 years earlier. He landed in 1844, and he describes in his memoirs what he encountered. It was Saturday and such a sight. The dock was at once filled with wolves in sheep's clothing called runners and gin mill keepers. 2 or 3 would take hold of you and pull you to go with them, and another would take your small baggage and go away with it, and you would be lucky if you found all your belongings. Stories of immigrant successes abounded in English newspapers like the Potter's Examiner, and Carr and many others who came to this country read them eagerly. There was, in truth, just simply no room in Staffordshire, England in the 1840s for an ambitious potter of limited means to strike out on his own. Fortunately for Carr, he did have a friend who was looking out for him, and he, upon landing in Maiden Lane, made his way across the harbor to Jersey City and found lodging and stayed in and was sent for by a friend to call in for work at the American Pottery Manufacturing Company in Jersey City. And we have a wonderful image of that here. And I will say the building still exists, and I believe are condos in Jersey City. But this, I can't stress enough the importance of this particular pottery. It was the training grounds for, it was really the first successful tableware maker manufacturer in the United States. They made creamware, which you see in this teapot here, this kind of lighter bodied ware. And they made Rockingham glazed wares, which you see here in this hound-handled pictures. And they made transfer printed wares. And these were the kinds of things, particularly these finer plates were exported by English makers in droves. And so it's really quite remarkable that in the 1840s, the American Pottery Company was able to make these kinds of things. According to Carr's obituary, as I mentioned, he worked as a dipper and a foreman at the American Pottery Manufacturing Company. And it's here where he really took his skills that he learned working in the potteries. And mind you, he's only 24 when he comes to work here, but he's already worked for 14 years. And he brings these skills to America, which he applies to the conditions here. And that's a really important point. Here, as we'll see, as was also the case at the New York City pottery, you have issues with skilled labor. Skilled laborers have to be trained, or they are brought in from England. And the American Pottery Company certainly paid steerage. And they also, took employees from other companies. You also had the problem of adapting native materials, because not everything works. Different kinds of clays have different kinds of chemical compositions, and they don't all work the same way as they did maybe in Staffordshire. You also have the problem of obtaining materials for finer wares, and certainly capital to buy the materials, capital to pay the laborers, capital to build these works. and capital to buy the coal used to fire the kilns and the ovens and all of these things. So a tremendous outlay. And I just want to briefly orient ourselves with this, maybe perhaps a little bit confusing map, because this is, of course, the navigable waterways of New York Harbor. But our story is here. Carr lands in Maiden Lane over here by South Street Seaport. He makes his way over, can't even read this anymore, but Jersey City is over here, I believe. And then South Amboy, where he goes next, is down here by Perth Amboy. So on the other side of Staten Island. And I show the waterways because that's another important factor. These potteries had to be situated on waterways to transport the coal, the materials, and also the finished products. On March 17th, 1852, Carr has left the American Pottery Company, and he has rented the Swan Hill Pottery in South Amboy from a Captain Charles Fish. He rents it with Thomas Locker, Joseph Wooten, and Daniel Greatbach. You see three of their names here, but Daniel Greatbach was a highly skilled modeler of the period and is kind of well known among American ceramics collectors because he was capable not only of producing, some of the finer wares that were made at the American Pottery Company, but he also likely supplied the molds that Carr was able to use. And you see this really wonderful covered picture here with this very, great fine detail, which Carr wrote about in 1898. Is I have but one piece of rocking ware made in 1852 at Amboy. It is a covered picture modeled by Greatbach. The lip is covered and perforated, and it was used for milk or molasses. Carr here at Amboy, really experienced all the extreme difficulties of running a successful business. All right, I just wanted to put it on my headphones. Can you hear me okay? Alexis?
Yes. Yep.
Great. So what I wanted to say about South Amboy is that this is really where he put his skills into practice. His 8 years at the American Pottery Company, and it was extremely difficult to produce what he did in this short period of time. Not only, Carr himself supplied the principal capital, and the others, Locker contributed some, but the others too, very little, and they didn't stay long. But you can see by this rare price list that they made quite a bit. They even, the whiteware was probably something closer to that picture I showed, the kind of cream colored ware, and they also made a lot of Rockingham. This Carr might have continued there, but in 1854, on August 9th, there was a tremendous fire that destroyed the entire works. And there's a lively account, which I won't go into, from the Crockery and Glass Journal. But the struggle, of course, nothing was insured, and the struggle to rebuild the pottery was great. He notes that he had just $200 when it cost $35,000 to build up a works. And, and he paid back his creditors. He kept his workforce together for as long as he could. But in 1855, he accepts an invitation to move to New York City and start afresh. And I want to show you where that is. Here on the west side of Manhattan, just above this little triangle, on land that had been reclaimed. This was land that was underwater on West 13th Street. You see where the Hudson River Terracotta Works. Carr and his partner, we don't know his name, starts a pottery here, leasing 6 lots from the Astor estate here on West 13th. He took some of his finished white or cream wares from South Amboy to sell, but was probably making yellow ware and brown glazed, the sort of Rockingham style ware that you see here. And this is the only signed piece from this period. The stuff is extremely rare, I should say signed, marked. It's marked City Pottery, West 13th Street, New York. But you can see it has the same crisp molding that the Great Bach molds and may have been, we covered it. And I like this piece because it also says something about, you know, the hardships of making wares. This is an earthenware. As you can see, you can almost see the crazing, the crackling on the surface there. And, you know, so much of what was fired was lost in the kiln. And Carr struggled, had to have enough skilled workmen. And one of the phrases that he quotes when he complains about the quality of things coming out of the ware, out of the kiln, one of his workmen says, and he quotes him, "Don't worry, boss, rock will cover it. Rockingham glaze will cover any mistakes." In 1856, Alexander Morrison joined Carr's partner and and brought much needed capital. And Morrison Carr became the company, the two partners from 1858 until 1871 when Carr bought him out. So New York City Pottery was Morrison and Carr for this period. And this was really a formative period. Morrison, who Carr referred to as his savior from the West, was well connected and provided a capable partner. He also brought in a lot of revenue, a lot of not only revenue, but a lot of capital to build up the works. Carr acknowledged their arrangement in a rather cordial one, where Morris's ran the office, organizing marketing materials, and the jobbers who would go out to sell the works, and all aspects of the business side of things, while Carr managed the works, the factory itself. This was a standard arrangement across many industrial concerns in the US in this period, but certainly among the potteries in this country. On the one hand, a highly skilled immigrant such as Carr supplying the practical knowledge, and on the other, a native-born businessman such as Morrison to supply the capital and the business expertise. Obtaining suitable materials were an issue for American potteries, and Morrison and Carr took steps to change that. They invested in mining operations in Maine and grinding mills in New Jersey in order to obtain necessary ground feldspar and flint. But Carr admitted that he wasn't a businessman. When he sold his stock in these concerns, he didn't sell it at any profit. He didn't even get any return. So, he knew that he made mistakes along the way, but he kind of held to this higher standard that didn't always, this high standard that didn't always serve him well in business. This map from just slightly later, probably I would say the later range, 1862, gives a better idea of the size of the factory. And you can see here the New York City Pottery. 4 kilns, stables, I believe that says an office, brick buildings as well as wood. In 1875, the Crockery and Glass Journal described the plant this way. The premises and 13th Street embrace 7 city lots of 25 by 100 feet each. The entire area, with the exception of yards sufficient for storage and coal, being covered with brick buildings ranging from 2 to 3 stories in height. The kilns are 4 in number, 2 of them being used for the first burning, that would be the biscuit firing, or the conversion of the clay into biscuit, as the writer goes on. The others for the final or glazing processes. The interior of each kiln is 22 feet high and 17 feet in diameter, while the outer walls rise to the height of 60 feet. Each kiln has 11 fires, and the annual consumption of coal is not less than $12,000 worth. Carr's staff was comprised of a variety of skilled workers, including molders, turners, and china burnishers in every phase of production, and scores of potters would later open their own works. Scores of potters who passed through here, including John E. Jeffords, Robertson of the Chelsea Pottery Works, so many to name, Bennett, many potters, and I chronicled many of them, or at least, located many of them in my master's work. But I also want to point out that there's still a terracotta works operating behind here. So, one questions like who these people were, but you can see evidence of china decorators living in the neighborhood, as this industrial area really is surrounded by residential too. And many tradesmen for every phase of production. In addition, there were more mechanized processes such as the use of steam-powered jiggers and jollies to turn out plates, platters, and some bowls. And by this time, the press molding technique, which you saw in which is how those Rockingham ware pictures were made, was largely supplanted. The stability and capital Morrison brought enabled Carr to experiment with clay bodies. This led to the firm's introduction of more durable, wider-bodied ware, such as white granite, in 1858, and the decision to stop making the cheaper and less fashionable yellow ware in Rockingham. White granite is basically ironstone, and it was imported in tremendous amounts, and it was often unmarked, and American potteries made a lot of it in Trenton and in East Liverpool, Ohio, but US potteries often use misleading marks. And I'm showing you here Carr's mark, one of Carr's marks. And this one is interesting because it shows the British Royal Arms, the lion and the unicorn. So very misleading. He also has this conjoined JC, indicating that it is James Carr. But, they did this as a means of competing with the foreign imports. Nobody really wanted to believe that American manufacturers were capable of making ceramic ware that was just as good as a lot of the British imports. The ability to make a higher grade whiteware also meant a suitable surface for hand-painted decoration. And the census records that I mentioned from 1860 suggest that Morrison and Carr were among the first manufacturers in New York City to actively employ china painters. This was previously the domain, and continued to be the domain, of pottery and porcelain importers and independent decorating shops. And you can see here, this is the earliest dated piece that I know of, although there were certainly others, showing a lovely teacup for Miss Sarah Carr, James's daughter, in 1871. And here, this kind of, heavier white-bodied ware more indicative of the ironstone type white granite. That was, one of the main, really the mainstay of Carr's production. But here, with this very nicely banded decoration. But it was in 1876 that Carr really kind of moved into a larger stage. And we are really grateful that he did, because otherwise we would know very little about him. 1876 was the 100th anniversary of American independence, and it was marked by a World's Fair in Philadelphia, the International Exhibition of Arts, Manufactures, and Products of Soil and Mine, which we commonly refer to as the Centennial Exhibition. It was the first great international fair to be held in the United States. The exhibition sprawled over 285 acres and celebrated the country's thriving arts, industry, and commerce. More than 10 million visitors toured pavilions representing each of the American states and marveled at the artistic and industrial achievements on view. There were exhibits from every, not only the states, but 37 foreign countries. And you can see the sprawling bird's eye or balloon view of the grounds. And I just want to explain that American ceramics were exhibited in 3 places. The Women's Pavilion, which you see here, which showed a selection of hand-painted, not always on American-made blanks, but sometimes. And this is a lovely egg cup that was painted by Marie Louise McLaughlin of Cincinnati, and could have been one of the ones she showed there. And here we have the famous baseball vase, or sorry, the baseball vase by Isaac Broom for Otten Brewer of Trenton. And this is a huge work. It's over a yard tall, and was exhibited amongst the sculpture in the Fine Arts Building, Memorial Hall, which you see here. The exhibits of the U.S. Potteries Association, or National Potters Association as it was initially called, were exhibited here in the main exhibition. And I show you this highly emblematic, and some might say problematic, century vase that shows American progress with George Washington on the front and these heads of buffalo on the sides, and many scenes around. Carr too had his display in the main exhibition building. And here I show you a really rare and wonderful stereograph of Carr's exhibition booth. This is what he showed. Of course, we're seeing it in double. But, through this and I can't say that word, but with this image and with, and with the reports in the Crockery and Glass Journal, one is able to trace, as Gary Stradling did in his 1876 article for Antiques magazine, the wares that Carr was making at this time and showing. And this is really incredible because we don't really know that much about most of these. And you can see, the first thing you might notice is that there's an obvious lack of stagecraft, right? These potters had never exhibited in a World's Fair. This is a first chance. And of course, they're learning how to do it. You see stacks of centennial plates on the floor. You see even a log down here. And you see wonderful examples of majolica and parian. Majolica in these pedestals on each corner. This rustic styled garden pot here. And even down here in these small tablewares, which were very colorful, the sardine box here, and an oyster plate, but hard to see here. And then you also see parian ware. And you can see busts of George Washington, Alexander Campbell, Jesus Christ, and Henry Ward Beecher, and even Ulysses Grant, and then some other figures here. And I just want to point out too that the New York City pottery received scant praise in the official report of the U.S. Centennial Commission. The report read, James Carr, New York City, exhibits of white and decorated vitreous stone tea-wares and white-bodied ware decorated as majolica, not artistic. Parian busts and statuettes modeled after designs by Mr. Edge, the material fair. Some tentative specimens of pot sur pot on stoneware body, also of Emile Obrant, granite table and toilet wares, and that's it. But we can see in these surviving examples, which pours family, mostly family, but also other collectors placed in museum collections, that the parian was really quite well made. Here we see a bust of a woman called Evening, and we see a bust of a girl, Libby, both in parian, and both showing, you know, the real skill in making these. We saw, this gives you a little sense of scale. Here she is there. And I want to say that these were being made by a lot of exhibiting English factories. Parian is a material that is it's a clay body similar to porcelain. It's called Parian porcelain because it is this extremely white body, but you can't work it in the same way as clay. It has to be slip cast, meaning a swirl of liquid clay poured into a plastic mold in order to shape it. And these molds, you know, could be procured from a variety of sources, certainly overseas. And Carr did travel to England in 1871, but he also likely had relationships with importers in the city. And you can see, you know, here, they also just exhibit this really crystalline white surface. Parian, the name, comes from the Greek island of Paros, where marble was quarried. So, and it really was a way to create sculpture that could be shown in people's homes. Middle-class consumers could buy this and put it in their parlors. And this was a way to be part of, you know, to show your culture, to have these works of arts. The inclusion of religious figures demonstrate the centrality of the Christian church for many 19th century Americans, and the beliefs of the potter James Carr, who was a disciple of Christ for 9 years. And he also included a more controversial figure in Henry Ward Beecher. He was a well-known, extremely well-known minister at Plymouth Church in Brooklyn Heights, but he was also a figure of national stature, kind of a Billy Graham of his day. But it's funny that Carr chose to depict him at this time, because he was even perhaps better known for the scandal involving one of his female parishioners. And I'll say no more, but it led to a big lawsuit in 1874. Carr, it's hard to know whether Carr made this bust in sympathy or support, but he did give Beecher a copy. And Beecher wrote to Carr after receiving it, "It seems to me that the bust is even better looking than I am." Unfortunately, this bust, which used to be at the Yale Art Gallery, was broken at some point and discarded. And it may have been the same one that was at given to the Philadelphia Museum. An even more controversial subject was the Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. And you can barely really see, let me go back to my, under the glass dome here. Sumner, for those of you who know your American history, was a highly divisive figure, more divisive in the period leading up to the Civil War on the issue of slavery than perhaps, than anyone else, perhaps, except perhaps Lincoln. Sumner was one of the most outspoken critics of slavery, and he gave fiery speeches that enraged both parties. Following one famous speech anti-slavery speech on December 5th, 1855, an enraged South Carolina congressman caned Sumner. That means he hit him over the head with his gold-tipped cane at his desk on the Senate floor. Beaten unconscious, Sumner suffered massive trauma to the brain. He took 3 years to recover and did eventually return to the Senate, but he never fully recovered from his injuries. And this brutal incident, drew waves of outrage and really solidified kind of Northern support. And I kind of hesitate to bring this up in our own sort of national divisiveness, but I think it's important to remember that, these divisions existed then and now. But to look at this statue, and it's, it's small, it's a statuette. It's one of the factory's best works. It's crisply modeled details, his fingers, his face, his hair, his frock coat. He's sitting at a chair that is a simplified version of the Senate chairs. And he's got a crumpled newspaper beneath him. In some copies, you can almost make out a date on the letter or the newspaper. And it was made just after Sumner died in I should say the design is 1874. I mean, Carr's probably dates more to closer to 1876. And it was based, and I'm showing you an image that I found on eBay, but I wanted to show you that it is designed, that the design for the statuette was by the sculptor John D. Perry, who is a Vermont native who split his time between Massachusetts and Rome, and made this sculpture, which he patented November 12, 1874, just 6 months after Sumner died. So Sumner, in this period after the Civil War, that is the US Centennial, was on people's minds, during this period after, when people are still very much thinking of the Civil War. And, a more sort of recognized, widely recognized public hero would be this, really wonderful bust of General Grant. And this bust is the work of a modeler named W.H. Edge. I believe his name is William Henry Edge, who worked for the Pottery. We don't know too much about him, but he likely was English born and came from Trenton. But he was, responsible for creating these molds. And I think Carr couldn't resist having Edge make a parian bust of himself. And this is James Carr himself in the collection of the Newark Museum with his wonderful frock coat and his, I think this hair is so terrific too. But you can see how he is this very distinguished person at the peak of his career at this point. The other wares from the Centennial that I want to speak about are these, are his majolica. And these were also called out. This was, it's hard to understand, how elevated, what a big step this was for an American pottery to make these things. Majolica was a white-bodied, molded, and brightly glazed ware that was introduced already in 1850s in England, but not until this moment in the United States was it made successfully here. And Carr was one of the first, and he exhibited these at the Centennial. And I'm so delighted to have been able to see this wonderful surviving pedestal showing George Washington crossing the Delaware that survives in the family. And it will be one of the highlights of the exhibition that opens in New York in January. But you can see, obviously, how Carr and Edge, who I believe modeled this work, is really looking for expressions of American identity. He takes one of the most iconic paintings in the United States, Washington Crossing the Delaware by Emanuel Lutz, and puts it in molded form here. I mean, granted, it looks a little, perhaps cartoony, but these are little sculpted figures that are molded into the ware and then painted with majolica. Now, majolica, the glaze, is brightly colored enamel. I mean, here you have this wonderful, rich enameled blue, cobalt blue, which, is beautifully, and it's not without its fault. Things drip. The red burns out a bit, but it shows this, this real attempt at like showing some, producing these 2-foot tall showpieces for the fair. And these anchored the booth, and there were 4 of them. You can see them here. And here too, Carr was a practical potter. And when I saw this piece, you can see that, the mold was likely modeled on drain pipes, right? It is this thick white ware, very white bodied ware that is, just to fire something without cracks and is a challenge. And it shows too that Carr's clay bodies were really every bit as good as the British imports. I want to speak for a minute about sources. Actually, before I do that, I just want to mention too that Carr's, that the Centennial judges who gave that kind of scant praise initially, they weren't impressed by the aesthetic quality of the firm's wares. And they initially denied Carr one of the 13,000 identical gold medals awarded to meritorious exhibitors. And this decision brought protest from the community of American potters. And it also affected a reverse of the judge's decision, where they noted the parian being of a hard, well-vitrified body and of fine texture, and the majolica well-fired and coated with an excellent glaze of great hardness and transparency. The etchings under the glaze are commended for technical merit, and I want to show you here what that means. Here is a signed plate by Edge showing an etching under the glaze of none other than Rip Van Winkle, what could be more New England American or New York American than that, just as he's emerged from the Great Sleep when the Revolutionary War took place. An absence in that reprisal from the Centennial judges, which was written, interestingly enough, by Arthur Beckwith, who was a China painter himself and actually exhibited, but they didn't note any artistic merit. And I think, we can all draw our own conclusions on these wonderfully ingenious and wonderfully innovative wares. And I should say too, that this depiction of Rip is, taken from, is really derived from images that abounded of the actor, Joseph Jefferson, who played Rip Van Winkle on the New York stage in the years leading up. And these images abounded, not just this painting, which I think is really a very close represent, but also in carte de visites, photographs and such. But more about sources. So Carr was really trying to do something quite innovative in making American designs that were imbued with a national character. And this was really the mandate of the U.S. Pottery Association for the centennial. They chose that moment to really showcase their progress. But the truth is, much of Carr's production was and remained based on English designs. And certainly in majolica, where you see this wonderful pedestal, which is featured in the catalog for the exhibition. And here you can compare it to an earlier design by Royal Worcester. Highly sophisticated design, but a copy. And these, this copying went, I would hesitate to say it went both ways, but they were certainly looking at print sources for design. And this is, indicative of that. You can see some of the same motifs here, certainly. And here in one of the pieces that Carr's, a different concern of Carr's, this was a short-lived venture that he was part of. When Carr joined in the Lincoln Pottery in Trenton, New Jersey, where this majolica picture was likely made in 1879. And you can see it's almost identical to a picture made by George Jones in England. And here too, a later 1881 umbrella stand, which draws in its mold very closely to a stick stand or umbrella stand made by Fielding and Company. And here on the polychrome version, the English version, you see this, you can really see this Japanese-esque motif. It's not as visible here, where Carr has chosen to use more of an almost Rockingham style glaze, but you can see the colors in this modeled ware. And that just kind of shows the changing taste in majolica, going for these more kind of muted palettes and monochrome glazes. But this, I want to say too that Carr, may have, been, these kinds of copyings were also sometimes done at the request of crockery dealers. And it's entirely possible that Carr was commissioned to make wares following English molds. We don't know these things. But here you see, he also exhibited in 1878 at the Paris exhibition. And we don't know too much about that because, for one thing, the United States barely got a delegation together. It was not, hugely supported by Congress until the last minute. And then there were only a few companies who could really get a display together. And Carr's was a very small display. But we know that it included some majolica that was noted for its quality, including this, well, I should say a teapot like this cauliflower teapots seen here. We don't know what happened to that teapot. It went to the Philadelphia Museum, but it was later sold. But you can see, I'm showing this one by Griffin Smith and Company because his modeler, W.H. Edge, went to Phoenixville to work for this company. And it's possible that he took molds with him. We don't know. But this emblematic, I should say, a lot of majolica, and particularly this one, was based on earlier designs by, in here you can see Josiah Wedgwood's cauliflower teapot from a century earlier. But Carr, and I should say Carr, he won a medal in Paris. He won a gold medal, which is silver medal. That was the highest one in Paris. But he didn't, really, he didn't really capitalize on it. He did kind of upgrade his advertising in the Crockery and Glass Journal, and you can see these nice engravings here, but he's not talking about what was praised. He's not saying anything about his parian or finely decorated china, and he's not saying anything about majolica. Still, we have white granite, ironstone, CC, that's cream colored, druggist, plumber's ware, the mainstays of his production advertised. Perhaps more indicative of what he was capable of in 1878 is in this 1877 color lithograph that was added, and I say added because it was the last plate in a book on the treasures from the American Centennial exhibition. And it's not even in the table of contents, but it's there, plate 50, the very last thing, where Carr's works are placed under American porcelain. Now, none of these are porcelain, they are earthenware. I'll make, they're very nice white bodied ware, but they are not earthenware. And you can see though, there's a little bit more stagecraft, right? You've got this, beautifully displayed aesthetic mantelpiece, corner of a mantelpiece with these wonderful, here you have a majolica pedestal and the froggy jars. And I show you here, because this is one of the highlights, this recent discovery will be one of the highlights in the majolica exhibition. And you can see it here, these kinds of, and really a trade jar, but a very nice little tobacco jar with the frogs. And also too, these kind of finely painted china, semi-china with feldspar and kaolin that fired nearly as translucent as porcelain. And note that this plate here uses a new mark. Here we see the JC semi-china, and in the middle, proudly displaying the American eagle, so no more the British mark. And I just want to say that in the late 1870s, Carr had a new chronicler. Jenny Young wrote in her book on ceramics that Carr was making use of 6 or 7 different clay bodies, all composed of American materials at this time. She identified cream-colored ware and majolica, terracotta used for sculpture, and artificial porcelain, stone china, a staple sought for decorators, the stone china, semi-china with feldspar and kaolin that fired nearly as translucent as porcelain, as well as parian, which we've seen, the feldspathic body that imitates marble. So here, I just want to say this is the stone china, and this has the mark stone china. So this is probably the stone porcelain that she mentions. And this, could be, this is probably also stone china. Carr, this really beautiful, really remarkable. This is part of the tea set that I believe it was on display at the Brooklyn Museum, at least it was when I visited. And it's, you can see just, really the high quality application of gold here. This, wonderfully painted butterfly, these kinds of molded and decaled here, but really very sensitively done and in the highest kind of Victorian taste. Carr wrote as to bone china, when I got to make it, and had all my shapes and materials on hand. I found that a large firm downtown was selling English china made in Longton for cheaper than I could make it. So I used up my material and stopped. I don't know if that was this, or if it was his earlier teacup, like the one that we saw in 1871. We really can't know those things without really close analysis of the chemical compositions of the clay bodies. But it's interesting to say, you know, that there was so much competition at this time, not only from Carr, from English and also other European imports, but also increasingly from domestic potteries. And here, as far as the stone china, a staple sought by decorators, you can see, this is directly taken from the Met's website because I'm not really supposed to show it, but you have John Malky Falconer's, a known painter, who painted on the ceramic blank, which came from the Carr pottery. And you can see, again, that same mark with the eagle and shield. And this wonderful inscription, which tells exactly what it is, the oldest house in St. Louis, and also, interestingly, identifies a plaque made by James Carr, New York, colors of LaCroix, Paris, France. Also, possibly, this plaque by John Bennett, one of the noted china decorators in New York at the time, who had his own kind of china decorating firm and sold many great things. He was known to purchase blanks from the pottery. We don't know, you know, which ones were Carr's, but we know from record books that he did. And Carr also taught, or at least the pottery. And we don't know who. We suspect maybe his daughters could have taught the faience and enamel painting at the pottery. So in this way, you know, Carr really, you know, through the blanks and through these classes, he really participated in what was the China craze for ceramics, China mania, China decorating in the late 1870s and 1880s. And we see here one really terrific example, this bread tray, which I just adore, with this wonderful dog in the center. It's a majolica pattern plate. You can see that it's molded, but it's not majolica glazes. These are overglazed painted, and shows, you know, just really lovingly painted. But it has that same mark, stone china. So heavy British coat of arms here too. So that's quite interesting. And here too, these kind of idiosyncratic works, these are actually hand carved by a sculptor by the name of Henry Lancaster. And I'm showing you two works. The green one will be in the Majolica exhibition. The lighter colored one is in the Brooklyn Museum. And these are really kind of unusual. These are made by a sculptor who I can find nothing about. He appears in the city directories, but one time from 1978 to 79, living near the Pottery. And he has working with these vase forms from the Pottery and carving into them while they are still green before they're firing, and then painting them after they're fired with majolica glazes this time. So really unusual. Now, I know we're running over, and I'm going to bring this story to a close with this map, which shows, which I think more than anything is emblematic of the demise of Carr's pottery. This is in 1891. In 1888, Carr decides to close his potteries. He is called into the Astor's office and told that he needs to either tear down or close his building. And is offered the opportunity to build something else on the plots that he has leased for so long. And he does. He realizes that he can make more money selling, and his pottery is roughly here. He realizes that he can make more money with commercial space that is near the open air market, that is the Grosenberg market. This is the beginning of the meat packing industry. And you see the meat packing district that we know in New York. But you can see here the West Washington Market buildings and this open space. You can also see, just to point out, that this blue line is the original shoreline of Manhattan. So all of this, including the piers, is built on fill. So with that, the New York City comes to an end in the New York City pottery comes to an end in 1889. And just to show you what's there now, the Standard Hotel, and that was built in 2009. But Carr was not idle in those last years. He enjoyed his new stat, he enjoyed his family, and he was surrounded by here with his children, one of his several sons and his daughters here, and grandchildren. And here, I love this photo in Asbury Park. And he, took this time to really secure his legacy. He enjoyed this kind of his growing image as a pioneer potter, one of the oldest living. And he wrote to Edwin AtLee Barber, who was the curator at the Philadelphia Museum, who was researching his own history of pottery and porcelain in the United States. And they negotiated several works entering the collection, including that wonderful pedestal of George Washington, several of the Parian bust, many other pots, the cauliflower teapot, and other things. Unfortunately, as taste kind of shifts in the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, Philadelphia deaccessioned almost all of these works, and sold them at auction, and we don't really know where they all went today. But he also, I just want to say, he reveled in the achievements of many that came after, especially his son, Thomas Carr, who became the president of the Warwick Pottery Company, later Carr China Company in Grafton, West Virginia. And he wrote down his memoirs, his story, thereby kind of sealing his legacy. My life has been, it seems to me, a series of mishaps, he wrote. Well, it will be soon closed, and I shall be forgotten. These acts of writing down his story and placing his works in museums helped seal his legacy. And during a time when pottery seldom lasted more than 10 years, Carr succeeded at the New York City Pottery for more than 35. And at his peak, he struggled against many kinds of issues with labor and materials and all of these things, particularly competition from cheaply produced foreign goods. But he still prevailed and made those works that I shared with you tonight. So I want to thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was fantastic. We have a few questions that have rolled in, so I'll start with those, and if anybody else has anything that they would like to ask, they can type away. So the first question we have is if you know the address of the American Pottery Manufactory in Jersey City.
Offhand, no, but the Jersey City Museum has a nice little write-up on their website about the American Pottery Company, and there are actually pictures of the existing buildings today. So I would suggest that you go to just do a little Google search on that.
Okay. The next question is if we know anything more about Carr's connections to the Disciples of Christ movement.
I know that he was he was converted to Methodism as a youth, and actually when he was in Middlesbrough, so after he had left home, and he became a disciple of Christ very soon thereafter. And he maintains throughout his life that it was his faith and his sort of, willingness to work, to kind of lead a straight and narrow life and not, succumb to drink and all of these other things, spend his money in all these other ways that enabled him great success. And I know that he, he certainly stayed in the church his whole life, and he had a very nice obituary from the church, that kind of talks about his relationship and his, stewardship. He was even writing checks, right before he died, to the church for their building campaign. So it was very much a part of his faith, but I don't know the full art, just the very beginning and towards the end.
Okay. Next up, we have two questions relating to John Rogers. So one is if he ever mentioned competing with John Rogers, and then the follow-up is that the English were selling a huge amount of parian here, including busts of American political figures. And John Rogers had experimented with having his plaster figures done in parian in England, and why was Carr not more active with his parian works?
Well, I can tell you that Carr was a very practical potter, and I should have spoken to this more clearly. He only produced parian for possibly, I don't even think, he produced majolica for 2, maybe 3 years. Parian, I think he produced for even a shorter period. I think it was really only for the centennial. He recognized that there was lots of competition for this, and it wasn't something that he could continue to do successfully. I mean, I will say there are other things going on in the background. In 1879, there's a big kind of labor issue in Trenton, but also in the New York City pottery, where there are strikes. And, so much of this business is about making money. And that was his goal in the end, to make some money and elevate the potter's art. And in the end, he really did both. But as far as Parian and his relationship to John Rogers, I don't know. But I mean, I think certainly, everybody knew what everybody else was up to. It was all displayed. It was all written up in the trade journals. And being in New York City, he had access to, he certainly had representatives who were going out to all the concerns. So he knew what was going on. And certainly, Roger, people were getting molds from different people at this, from some of the same people at the same time.
Our next question refers to the advertisement that you showed, and what are the all kinds of porous cells made to order? What
yeah. My understanding of porous cells made to order is that these are earthenware bodies. Carr never really did make, he never made porcelain, unless you want to count parian as a porcelain body. Earthenware is by nature non-vitreous. It is porous. Water seeps through it. That's why you glaze it. So that is what that refers to. The earthen, and there is a variety. Of course, there's a huge spectrum of earthenware bodies, from the yellowware and the Rockingham on the lower end up to this kind of stone china, which is very nearly vitreous, but not quite.
How did you start in on Carr? What attracted you to it? How did you find out about him? He's not someone that's in the pantheon of everyday.
Well. Yes. Well, believe it or not, I actually used to make pottery before I did my master's degree at Bard. But while I was at Bard, I did independent study. I did an independent study with the great ceramics historian Ellen Dinker, and where we looked at Canova, transfer of printed pots, particularly the Canova plate that I showed from the American Pottery Company. And she introduced me to his memoir. And it was just such a fascinating read. It's hard to quote because of the long-winded way that 19th century people write, but it was just this like wonderfully rich description of an American potter's life. And it really encompasses the whole arc of the growth of the American pottery industry in very real personal ways.
Follow-up question, sort of, about how many potteries were in Manhattan at the time? I mean, you think of them mostly as being in New Jersey or,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, that's a hard question to answer. I would say not many. I mean, certainly in the beginning of the period, there, you know, in 1855, I think is about when George Cartledge's works close in Greenpoint, and he was making a kind of salt paste porcelain, particularly door furniture. And there were certainly terracotta works, but not so many. I mean, in terms of these whiteware manufacturer, he was really the first, and I think actually, and the only, because, you know, as I hoped I conveyed, we were a bit rushed, you know, in that last map, you know, the industry, these industrial areas in 19th century Manhattan were changing, and Carr couldn't expand beyond those few, you know, that small footprint, whereas the potteries in Trenton and Ohio were tremendous. They covered huge acreage, had many more kilns and many more buildings.
And how did you find the family, and what information and what objects have surfaced from your connections with them?
Gosh, you have to remember that I started this 20 years ago, or at least I worked on this 20 years ago, but I was really fortunate. I must have met Helen Drennan Carr, who is now deceased. I must have gotten in touch with her through notes that were in the file in the Metropolitan Museum, and Nani Freelinghausen, the curator there, was kind enough to share that with me, so that I reached out and saw that, you know, she had that wonderful pedestal at home. I mean, or members of the family, and I was able to, you know, visit and see some of those works firsthand then. So I'm excited to see them again when they come.
I think, does anybody, are there any other questions? I think that might be it, because I know we've run over and
Sorry.
able to get going. No, it was fascinating. It was great. We didn't want to end it. So thank you so much, though, for your talk. Very enjoyable way to spend a gray, rainy evening.
Thank you, Alexis. Thank you, Eve. And thanks to all of you for sticking with me through this. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you.